January 3rd, 2024, the City Council Committee on Public Health, Safety, and Environment, co-posted with the Committee of the Whole, will meet in person, or is meeting in person on Tuesday, January 16th, 2024 at 6 o'clock for the purpose of meeting to discuss opting into the specialized opt-in code. The meeting will be held in the City Council Chambers, 93 Washington Street, Salem, Mass. Second floor. In-person is the primary method of public access to such meetings. A secondary method of public access may be provided, if technically feasible, through Salem Access TV or remotely through Zoom. And if you're calling in through the telephone, it's 877-853-5257. Hello, everyone. It's the meeting of the Public Health, Safety, and Environment. All committee members are in attendance, and from the Committee of the Whole, we have Councilor Harvey, Councilor Hapworth, Councilor Stott, and Councilor Varela. Okay. I'm going to do just so people know what, like the order of business, so we can get out of here in an hour. I will do a quick history, and then I'm going to turn it over to Neil Duffy, who's the Director of Sustainability and Resiliency for the City of Salem, who will do a PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll open it up to the council members who might have concerns or questions for Mr. Duffy. We also have in the room Ulla Servasis from our building commissioner, and who will be implementing the code, hopefully. The International Panel of Climate Change recently issued a dramatic comment that just the amount of extraction of fossil fuels in the pipeline already will result in a temperature rise of 3 degrees. And we already know that 1.5 degrees over the temperature from the industrial age is the tipping point. On November 17th of last year, the Earth actually reached 2 degrees over that point, which is a catastrophic omen. This is about reducing carbon. It's almost impossible to quantify the impact from storms now, and it's difficult to know how much resiliency adaptation we'll need to protect our residents, businesses, and environment. We can, as Councilor Gerslow was quoted in the Salem News, address our infrastructure. The built environment in Salem is the biggest generator of greenhouse gas emissions, so we must make our buildings more sustainable. Here's some historical context. While Vice Chair of the Sustainability, Energy, and Resiliency Committee, and with the help of several others, I wrote a green building ordinance. The City Council passed the version for municipal buildings in January of 2022. It's as strong as any in the state, mandating LEED Gold or Passive House design and solar or green roofing. I then worked for over a year with our planning department and Councilor Stott, thank you, on one for non-municipal properties. But when Mr. Duffy was hired and we met, he identified several components of the ordinance that conflicted with the stretch code that we adopted in 2009, and suggested that ordinances sometimes create unintended problems for enforcement and don't and that the enhancements to the stretch code that will be implemented this July in adopting the specialized code may be more productive and easier to implement. So I met with Mayor Pangallo, who's endorsed the code, our solicitor, Mr. Duffy, then Chair Varela, Acting Building Commissioner Stavrolis, and others in the spring of last year. Mr. Duffy and I have met several times, and we know that education of inspectors and contractors is vital. And Mr. Duffy already has had a training for inspectors and will again this spring prior to the stretch and specialized code effective dates, and will probably include contractors as well. 32 communities have already adopted the code that account for over 25% of the state's population. 3 were effective last July. 21 effective this last January 1st, and 7 effective July of 2024. We know we'll need to construct resiliency measures such as stronger seawalls and stormwater mitigation, and we'll need a means to pay for it, as it won't be cheap. Opting into the specialized code will enable us to realize grant funding that we'll need. And we know Salem is an example for many communities on the North Shore, and we need everyone to participate in being more sustainable. So now I'd like to invite Mr. Duffy to the podium to do a presentation. Yeah, he's going to tell me to press that, right? Why can't I have a Mac?
Thank you, Councilor Cohen. Thank you all for coming tonight and for having me to speak about the opt-in specialized code. I wanted to mention that hopefully, I think joining us on Zoom are Dylan Patel, who is the Northeast Regional Coordinator for the Green Communities Division at the Department of Energy Resources, as well as Michael Rossi, who works for ICF as a consulting firm that works with DOER on code outreach and education. So they're there for if there are additional questions or information needed that I may not be able to answer, or we need a little bit more information, they're there for in a supportive role in case we need it. So I just wanted to provide some background on the specialized code and what it means. You can go to the next slide.
Oh, what did you? There you go. Okay, now you're good. Still press that? Yeah, now you're good. All right, sorry.
No problem. So energy code choices. So Salem and every city and town in Massachusetts, up until last year, we had 2 choices for an energy code, and now we have 3. There's the base code, which you just by default is what our energy code would be if we had not adopted the stretch code in 2009. The stretch code has been adopted by, well, it was over 300 communities, but now 31 of those, it may be 32. Councilor Cohen said 32. I don't know if his numbers are more updated than mine, have moved on to the specialized code, which is stretchier, if you will, than the stretch code itself. So the reason it says automatic for Salem is that when you adopt the stretch code, and similarly with the specialized code, you're adopting the current version of that code, but then you're adopting any future modifications and amendments of that code going forward. It's similar with the base code. So the base energy code is updated on a 3-year cycle, and then based on what that base code is, the stretch code is then updated or not, and then that becomes our code automatically. So we've been part of that process since I think the stretch code was effective in Salem in 2010. So this would be a similar process where City Council would adopt the specialized code, and then that would be the energy code in Salem. Next slide, please. This is just a map showing code adoption, hard to read the cities and towns, but the lighter blue is all the stretch communities. The darker or sort of royal blue color is the specialized communities. And then the sort of tannish white color are the base code communities. So, well over 80% of the population lives in a stretch code community. About 25% of the population lives in a specialized community, and the expectation is that at least a dozen or so more municipalities between now and the beginning of the summer will be adopting the specialized code. So it's been adopted rather rapidly since it became available last year. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to remind all of you about Resilient Together, which is Salem's climate action plan. One of the major goals for Resilient Together is to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And one of the actions that has been identified in that plan that was adopted by the city is to adopt the state In the plan, it's called the State Net Zero Energy Building Code because at the time the plan was written, we didn't know what that net zero energy building code would be. But now we know it's called the Specialized Energy Code. So that is an action that we identified a couple of years ago in the planning process as an important one. And the reason it's important is because over half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. So if we're going to try to achieve emissions reductions and that goal of net zero emissions by 2050, we certainly need to address our new construction and our existing buildings. Next slide. So a big part of that strategy is to electrify buildings and to build buildings that are heated and cooled with electric energy going forward. And the reason for that is because electric energy is coming from renewable sources, and in the state of Massachusetts, we're required to increase that proportion of renewable energy every year, such that if you built a building today, for instance, that was all electric, it would have somewhere in the range of like 14% less emissions than that same building if it was built heated with gas. But going forward, every year on top of that, that electric building will have less and less emissions because the electricity that is powering that building will be cleaner and cleaner. So that's really, it's the core of Salem's strategy. It's the core of every city and town's climate action plan strategy, and the state's, as well as the country's, is to electrify not just our buildings, but also the transportation sector. So I just wanted to provide that big picture context for you all as you consider the opt-in code, specialized or opt-in code. Some of the basics and highlights of this code, really important to understand, is that as far as the specialized code goes, it only applies to new construction. So additions and renovations need to comply with the updated stretch code. There is no difference between the updated stretch code and the specialized code. The point of the specialized code is to accelerate electrification now, and also to make sure that it'll happen in the future should someone build with fossil fuels. So it requires some pre-wiring for electrification now, so that if a building needs to be converted later, it's not as heavy of a lift as it is currently. The proposed effective date for this code right now is that it would be effective on July 1st of 2024. And one reason that that's significant is the stretch code, the residential stretch code, takes a bit of a jump on July 1st, 2024, such that it will be more stringent. So there won't be as big of a difference between the stretch code and the specialized code on July 1st. It also is a requirement for the Department of Energy Resources' new Climate Leaders program that they announced this past year. You probably all are aware that Salem is a green community, so Mass DOER has had the Green Communities program for over a decade. Salem's received about $1.3 million in Green Communities grants. To be a green community, you have to meet certain designation criteria. One of them is to adopt the stretch code. So similarly, they just created this new Climate Leaders program, which will make grant funds available to cities and towns that become designated as climate leaders. And so that would provide Salem with access to grant funding that we would otherwise not have access to. It's not exactly clear what those funds will be eligible for yet. They haven't announced that, but likely it would be focused on community projects and renewable energy. Next slide. So another important part of the specialized code is that it includes high performance standards for large homes that use fossil fuels. So any home that's greater than 4,000 conditioned square feet that uses fossil fuels must be net zero energy. So that means that any energy that home uses must be spoken for, if you will, with renewables. So that's a stringent requirement for large single-family homes. Yeah,
Can I just ask you, what does conditioned square feet mean?
just the space. So like, if you have a 4,000 square foot home, but then you have like a 100 square foot garage that you're not heating or cooling, that's not included in the conditioned space that you're heating or cooling, basically.
Thank you.
I mentioned it earlier, but one of the big requirements in the specialized code is that it requires builders to pre-wire buildings that use fossil fuels. So it doesn't ban fossil fuels, but it's saying that if you are going to build with natural gas, in this case, that you need to also pre-wire it such that once that building needs to be electrified, it's a much easier process. Additionally, buildings that use fossil fuels, other than some exemptions for shaded sites and passive house buildings, would need to install a certain amount of rooftop solar. Yes, Councilor Cohen?
It's my understanding that's also 4,000 square feet or more.
For the solar?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. And then last, there's a high-performance standard for large multifamily over 12,000 square feet, where those types of buildings need to use the passive house pathway. And one of the reasons for that is that that size building and larger became a place where, when DOER was doing modeling and studying the impacts of this code, where passive house becomes much more cost effective is when you start to get into those larger multifamily buildings. So that's one of the reasonings for that requirement. If you go to the next slide. So I don't expect anyone will be able to read this necessarily. So sorry for the small type, but what this table is showing, if you just look at the first two rows, those are for single-family homes up to 4,000 square feet. So the first row is for all-electric building, and the second row is for a mixed-fuel building. And what this is demonstrating is, if you go across that first row, it's showing you for the all-electric building what's required for a stretch code and what's required for specialized. And because you probably can't read that, but I can tell you that there are no differences in the requirements. But for the mixed fuel building, if you're building with gas and if you're doing the specialized codes, as mentioned, you need to pre-wire that building for electricity, and then you need to put solar on that building where feasible. So again, if you built a home under 4,000 square feet and you're heating it with gas, you can do that, but you just need to also have it ready for electric heat when it needs to be converted later on. I'm not going to go through every building type, but similar for all of them. The electric version, same requirements, not more stringent. But when you get to a home that's heated with gas or fossil fuels, then there's the requirement of pre-wiring. If you just go to the next slide. So similar with all these building types, the one that I had mentioned earlier, which is different, is for multifamily over 12,000 square feet, where even for the all-electric version, the path to compliance is passive house in the specialized, and there are two other paths to compliance in the stretch code. So that was a lot of code talk and information. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
So I'm going to start real briefly. Really important, Mr. Duffy and I were talking about a lot of the projects that are in process of getting permitting, he's looked at, and they already, conform to the code. And that's really important, if you'll agree, Mr. Duffy, because those are projects that are not mandated by law currently to do what they're doing. And I have two examples. The the residences on Canal Street, the Bertini project, and 275 Lafayette have both decided to go all electric. And Mr. Duffy and the developers of the Canal Street project had a conversation, even though they'll probably be permitted before this this and the stretch code enhancements take effect. And Mr. Duffy shared with the developer some really significant rebates and incentives for development of passive house design. So if people know Leafort Terrace, the Waring School in Beverly, and the two new CDC buildings are passive house design. Does that make sense to you? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm assuming it does. Let's open it up to the council. Councilor Proznuski.
If I was building a home that's 4,000 plus square feet and I need to electrify it, how much more is the cost of putting in that extra electrification? Well, what would that add to the cost?
So, I mean, if you're building a home and you need to pre-wire it, the cost is going to be whatever that pre-wiring is. So you're basically building, for all these building types, you're building the electric version of that home, and then you're adding gas, if that makes sense.
Prior to this code, I wouldn't have to enhance the electrification. So that's an additional cost that I would have in building, and I'm just curious around what figure that would be. How much of a percentage would that add to the cost of building a home or a building?
Yeah, again, it really depends on the building, to be honest. I mean, the intention here is actually, especially when you're talking about residential homes, I mean, the intention is that we're not incentivizing the fossil fuel choice. So it's not, it's meant to be more expensive. It's the cost of the gas hookup, if there is no gas hookup. It's the cost of the gas heating equipment to be installed.
And is there a program that assists builders in doing this?
The opposite. There's programs that assist builders in building all electric. There are very generous incentives to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Before I turn it over to someone else, I think I have a question for you that might also answer Councilor Proznuski's question. So you didn't really talk about it, but in the July enhancement of the stretch code is a significant change to the HERS rating, which is the energy efficiency rating. And my understanding, correct me, Mr. Duffy, is that the change in that HERS rating is more than encouraging buildings to electrify. Makes it more difficult for them to remain in fossil fuel.
I would say that the HERS rating that builders need to comply with, again, on July 1st, part of the reason that number was chosen is because that is the place where it's basically there's cost parity between the fossil fuel building and the electric building.
Councilor Marcillo and then Councilor Jerslow.
Thank you, Chair. So just to go back to the question from Councilor Proznuski about the cost. From what I understand, in July with the updated stretch code, which is what we're using, right, in Salem, we're using the stretch code currently.
Correct.
All this stuff would be the same, right? The table that you showed for what would need to be done for 4,000 square feet or more in a home, that would be in effect anyways, whether we adopt the specialized code or not, correct? Because I think the chart has it the same.
No, so the 4,000 square feet or more case is maybe not the best one to use, but we can use it. So if you're building over 4,000 square feet, if it's a stretch code, if you don't adopt the specialized code, then on July 1st, if someone was to build an all-electric over a 4,000 square foot home, they would have to meet a HERS 45, or they could go to Passive House. If they were building a mixed fuel over 4,000 square foot home, they would have to hit a HERS 42 or Passive House. But they wouldn't need to pre-wire, and they wouldn't need to put solar on the home.
Okay.
If somebody's building one that's over 4,000 square feet in a specialized, like the same HERS 45 is required if it's all electric. If it's mixed fuel, you can't do a HERS 42. It would have to be Passive House, or it would have to be what's HERS 0, which is like a net zero home. So basically, they would have to be adding renewables that would offset all of the energy use on the home.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. So
Just quickly, it's a little bit nitpicky, but you can, if you are Passive House certified, you don't necessarily need to put on solar. So there's some give and take there.
Okay. So talking about solar, so if they go that route, you said if the solar would be done if feasible?
Yeah. So
Who decides if it's feasible?
it's in the code, like in terms of like what's shaded and not. And homes need to be solar ready, so that solar ready zone needs to be pointed out by builders. That's in the code.
Does it require taking down trees around the building?
No, so that's why the exemption's there, so you wouldn't require that.
Okay. All right.
If I could just, on solar, I know a little bit about that. So it's very easy. There are actually companies that can use their phone to figure out what the percentage of shade is, and there are percentages. So you can actually put the phone up over the roof, and it will tell you it's an 80% shade or whatever, and that's in the code. So if it's more shaded than that, you don't have to do solar. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. I really worry about the pressure to remove trees in order to get solar panels on buildings. So that's, I don't know what the balance is there. I don't know what the trade-offs are. Providing the shade for buildings in the neighborhood versus creation of energy. That would be something that would be interesting if you have any information on that. I know that our tree warden in the past couple of years has run into these issues where people have asked for city trees to be taken down so that they can put in solar panels, and luckily they've pushed back on that. But anyways, it's just one of those issues.
In the specialized code, if it's too much shading, you're not required to do this.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the reason it's there.
All right.
So people aren't cutting down trees.
Yeah, okay. And then lastly, education. Whether it's the specialized code or the updated stretch code, how do people find out about this? How do builders find out about the changes coming in and how it affects them? How much support does the city give, or the state?
So part of the change that's happened over this year is that the stretch code and part of the rollout for the stretch code has been handled by DOER rather than BBRS. And I think Vula can back me up. The rollout wasn't great on the stretch code update. And so that rollout is happening like a lot more now in terms of letting people know about the changes and educating them. Councilor Cohen mentioned we had a training a couple months ago here in Salem. We had our building officials from other municipalities and builders that we invited, just working with the planning department on builders that we should reach out to. Our plan is to continue doing that outreach throughout the year, depending on the decisions you all make. It would be either stretch or specialized or both. It's a very similar training. The training we did a couple months ago was the stretch code, and because the specialized is not that different than the stretch code, it really is. That's what's really important. So it's through DOER and through cities and towns and through other organizations as building official organizations is how they get the information.
Go ahead.
Councillor Gerslow, and then Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a quick question. On the stretch code, it was a little vague when it said certain additions and renovations that require building permits. Can residents who have gas in their homes now apply to the city to have a separate gas line installed for, say, an outdoor generator, a gas generator?
Yeah.
Will they still be able to do that?
Yep.
Okay.
And I would just say, again, with additions and renovations, in terms of what you're discussing tonight and the decision you're making, as far as specialized goes, there's nothing in the specialized codes that impacts additions and renovations. So everything that's required of additions and renovations will still be required no matter how you decide on the specialized.
Well, the stretch code just said certain, but it's very vague. It doesn't really go into it.
Right.
What that means, certain, what they really mean by that, like nobody would have a problem going forward with that, getting a separate gas line put in.
So there's nothing that's restricting anyone from putting a gas line in for a backup generator.
Okay, and you wouldn't have to do anything else, like wiring or anything else?
I can't really speak to it unless it was like a specific project, to be honest. But I think the point I'm trying to make, and I'm happy to follow up with this because it's a stretch code question, and I don't want to go into the rabbit hole of the intricacies of the stretch code because it can get very complicated. And I think that's actually part of the education I think there's some confusion with like what's required of the stretch code and what's required of the specialized code.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. To answer your question, Councilor Masillo, most of your contractors, all contractors have to do a renewal for our license every couple of years. And I just did mine, and 90% of our class was about the stretch code and this new extended, which is coming in July. So they're informed before they even, as they renew their license, they are informed about that. But now I have a question in regards to all electric. I know here in Salem, National Grid has an issue with their infrastructure and being able to supply. So for instance, like I know in Danvers right now, you can't even put a 200 amp service in a single family house anymore. It has to go to 400 because of car chargers and everything else like that, and trying to go all electric with the heat pumps and electric stoves instead of gas stoves and all this. So now, to answer Councilor Prosnewski's question, there is a significant amount of money that comes out of basically the homeowner's pocket to upgrade to do all this. But again, my question is Grid and everybody on board with this? Because the more we put onto the system, it's just going to start failing, in my opinion. I mean, I've already ran into this when I did a job a few years ago. I asked to go to add a new 400 amp service down on, what's that hall? Down by Broadway, or Broad Street. Anyways,
Hamilton
here in the
Hall.
historic district. Hamilton Hall. And basically, Grid told me they couldn't supply me with the 400 amps I needed for the service at Hamilton Hall, and they would have to take it from Broad Street, which meant adding poles, and then they wanted to charge the client like $26,000 to add the poles so that they could get the service that they needed for the building. So that would be my concern. And my next question would be, if you're in the historic district and you do a full gut on a project, is that considered a new project because you've demoed more than, say, 75% of the building? And if that's the case, what about putting solar panels on a historic building? Is the Historic Commission on board with that? I can't even put an exhaust vent for an ERV outside of some of the buildings in the historic district because they don't want to see a vent on the side of the building. So there are a lot of added costs, not to just the contractor, but to the end user, especially in Salem. I mean, now it's in my code as an electrician also, we have to supply a car charging unit. Well, if I have a house on Derby Street that's a single or a two-family house and I have to supply a car charging unit, well, they don't even have driveways to park their cars. So what do? Put a post out in front of their house and have them drag a cord across the sidewalk? I mean, these are some of the things that are being
Put
overlooked.
it at my house.
Yeah. So those are just a few of my concerns as far as for the end user and the contractors that have to abide by all this.
Yeah, no, all great points. I think I'll address, well, first on the grid, and I've asked these similar questions. I may just read some of the responses I've gotten from DOER, the people who developed the code, just to, it may be just easier just to read what their response is. Part of it is you had mentioned the EV charging requirement. If there is a concern about the impact on the grid, it's more connected to that than it would be to the specialized code. And that's because the size that these new homes need is typically doesn't need to be increased if you're heating electrically, because you're with the assumption that you're putting in central air. And so you wouldn't necessarily need to go higher than, if you were putting in a 200 amp service, you wouldn't necessarily need to go higher than that 200 amp service to heat in the winter. That same service would still provide that needed load for that building. So it really, if there is a concern on the grid and what some of these provisions are doing to the grid, it's more attached to the EV ready requirements, and the EV ready requirements are the same in the base code and the stretch code and the specialized code, so it doesn't change in the specialized. That EV ready requirement's still there. In terms of EV ready for an existing home, like you mentioned, that's not something that people are required to do. That's for new construction, and if someone doesn't have a spot, then they're not required to put in EV charging. If they park on the street, they're not required to put in EV charging. So that's not a requirement. And then in terms of the historical piece, again, I mean, if the folks on Zoom want to chime in on this, but you're not required to. There are historical exemptions.
Councilor Harvey, I did want to mention also the opt-in specialized code is only for new construction. So gutting a building, renovating a building would not apply. Yep. So it would only be under the stretch code, not the specialized code. Council, are you? Yep. Councilor Watson-Felt.
Thank you, Chair. I actually do have a question a little bit back on the chart we were looking at, the low-rise residential buildings table. For building sizes under 4,000 square feet with mixed fuels, and the requirement under the specialized code to pre-wire, how does that, I guess my biggest question is, how does that affect the building of accessory dwelling units? We had a really robust conversation. I was trying to go through my phone and remember exactly where we landed on the robust conversation we had here in council about taking out specific meters and the sources of utilities and all of that. And it made that conversation was sort of triggered in my memory when I saw that on the table, because if it is technically if it is a detached accessory dwelling unit, it is technically a new construction under 4,000 square feet. But there are some allowances, given its purpose and its size and its accessory use to the primary residence. And so could you speak to the requirements as they pertain to accessory dwelling units?
So if it's considered a new detached building, then it would be under those same requirements. So again, if the builder or the owner was insistent on using gas, then those requirements would exist for that building.
So, and I'm looking at Vula as well. Does the building commissioner nodding yes, no? Well, yeah, because by definition, an accessory dwelling unit is required to be under 4,000 square feet. It's not necessarily required to be separate construction, but it is usually always new and whatever its accessory capacity.
You need to use a 900 square feet, technically, you can't go over that. accessory dwelling.
Right.
And then if you do an addition over 1,000, then it would kick in on the stretch.
Oh, so there's a limit as well on the, so,
It would have the stretch code, but to define that space, over 1,000 square feet.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so
There's a lot of concerns that we have as building inspectors. As Neil had mentioned, it came into effect in January, and it was like a bomb hit all the building inspectors. And DOER put it in, and usually it would be through BBRS, which is our state agency with our building inspectors. So we were caught off guard, so we're trying to transition into enforcing all these new stretch code and new changes to, all the energy codes. So
yeah.
a lot of thought process here. I'm not against things. I just don't want us to run into something. Good points that you've made. Being in the construction field, I think you come across a lot of it, and I think hopefully we're not going to put a lot of big burden on contractors or push builders out of Salem, hopefully, with the bigger projects. That's the only concern I would have as an inspector, and we do the enforcement. So it's something we're all learning. It's a big learning curve.
So just for clarification, separate new construction, accessory use as a dwelling unit under 900 square foot or under doesn't even hit the stretch code.
So it does hit the stretch code.
It does.
We're a stretch community, so we have to enforce all that.
And it's all of it. Okay, yep.
But my concern is now we have accessory dwelling units that if we put it in, or if someone puts a permit in for it, it can't be over 900 square feet. Now we have, in our codes, we have to monitor if something's attached and over 1,000 square feet. So it's a fine line of where your enforcement. So this is the learning curve we're having as building inspectors. So an accessory dwelling unit, which depends on the town if you're allowing it, it's new construction, so it would be in effect. It is in effect.
So 900, yeah.
In our town now, we have accessory dwelling units here that have to be under 900 square feet, which have to be all on the same utilities with the building. So we have to analyze everything that comes forward.
That's my question, what you just said. So if they are on the same utility lines, right,
It has to be an accessory dwelling.
but they are also a new construction, so that would be, technically speaking, a required allowance. We would have to build that allowance in, right? Or we would have to come up with some different rule. So that's why I wanted to flag it, because there was a lot of conversation about shared utilities, and it would be new construction. And so I just want to know what, and the thing is, if I'm being honest, I'm less concerned about large developers. I am more concerned about, as we look to, encourage homeowners to build small-scale accessory dwelling units to help fill that sort of small-scale home opportunity, housing opportunity. I want to make sure that it's really clear for them and that the barriers to engagement for them are low. And then also, if there is increased cost because of this decision we make, then maybe the grant program needs to be adjusted. The grant program that's available for homeowners to create ADUs, maybe we need to look at that as well. So I just want to make sure that all of these intersection points are being addressed for the public.
And like you said, in July, it's going to be launched in effect.
Yeah.
Stretch code being maximized.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Two things. One, Michael Rossi from PSD Consulting has raised his hand. He's a consultant on code, but I just want to reinforce this point. An attached construction of an ADU does not The specialized code does not apply, only the stretch code, only if it's detached. And now I'm going to allow Michael Rossi to talk, because I think he's trying to address one of the comments here. Michael, you can...
Yes, thanks so much. So my name is Michael Rossi. I'm an energy code specialist with Performance Systems Development. I can just chime in a couple of the questions, and I'm happy to follow up for those I can't answer with Neil as soon as possible and provide him some more background that he can pass along to the council. When it comes to historic buildings, that question that was asked, Section R501.6 of the code for the 2021 IECC states that provisions of this code relating to the construction, repair, alteration, or restoration and movement of structures and change of occupancy shall not be mandatory for historic buildings, provided that a report has been submitted to the code official and signed by the owner, a registered design professional, or a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office or the Historic Preservation Authority having jurisdiction, demonstrating that compliance with the provision would threaten, degrade, destroy, or destroy the historic form, fabric, or function of the building. So essentially, historic buildings would be exempt from energy code requirements if there's any concern that it would degrade, destroy, or threaten the historic fabric of the building. And then when it comes to the question on trainings that was brought up, MassSave provides energy code training and technical support initiative through the Codes and Standards Support Initiative. And through that, we have opportunities such as checklists for code inspection officers, a summary of the changes to the code, permit application checklists, plan review checklists. We put together webinars on code updates. I believe we're about to launch a asynchronous training for those who want to take courses just sort of not at a specific time where they can do that. And PSD provides energy code training across the state to anyone that's interested, both through public webinars. We can also schedule private trainings. And then going back to the question on the grid, when it comes to the efficiency, part of it, I understand that there are going to be additional costs that might be added, or additional strain on the grid that might be added as part of that. But I also want to stress that a large part of the energy code efficiency requirements through insulation and tighter thermal envelope will help keep the energy of the buildings themselves low. So to sort of impact. Sorry, I was just muted.
Carry on.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was just going to say, when it comes to the grid efficiency, a big part of that is the units themselves might be a little bit more energy efficient due to the additional provisions there. And then I think that's all I had at this moment. If anyone has any additional questions, please let me know. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. If it's okay with the committee, Dylan Patel of Department of Energy Resources would like to volunteer some information. You can unmute. Dylan?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. My name is Dylan Patel, and thank you, Neil, for the introduction. I am with the Department of Energy Resources. I wanted to circle back to the first question that one of the councillors had made regarding wiring costs for electrification. I kind of have the benefit of watching this with a computer next beside me, and so I can give roundabout estimates of doing an electrical upgrade for a gas fossil fuel home. It's going to be about $2,000 to $4,000 for the panel upgrade, and about $1,500 per circuit. And if you're doing about 20, 30 circuits, it can be $30,000, $50,000. Having said that, so we're talking about a hypothetical situation where an existing building wants to convert to all electric. The whole point, that very high figure that I just mentioned, maybe half of that would be avoided by putting the pre-wiring in during the time of construction. That $50,000 figure is for an existing building where everything has already been built out. It's going to be a lot cheaper to do that for a new building, to get the pre-wiring done as it's being built. And then you also have the secondary benefit of making it a more sellable property. The second point I wanted to jump on Michael's really good explanation about the grid. And I think it's really important to understand that these electric buildings, they're going to be built anyway. And so we're really talking about, the whole point of this code is to minimize the incremental electricity consumption from these buildings. So that's why the specialized stretch code and the regular stretch code is really emphasizing energy efficiency and doing it in a way that has a minimal impact on the grid, because we do recognize here at DOER that this move to electrification is going to create some challenges for the utilities, and that is also a DPU issue. But in terms of the code, we're designing it in a way such that the new buildings are as efficient as possible, because if they weren't, then you're going to have much greater problems with the grid. So those are the two issues that I wanted to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
Hi, this is Michael with PSB. I have an additional comment on the accessory dwelling unit question. So because these dwelling units can be, a HERS rating can potentially be conducted on these dwelling units. So if additional alteration to an existing home is big enough to trigger the HERS rating requirement, which is over 1,000 square feet for an addition or change of use, or over 1,000 square feet and over 50% of the existing conditioned floor area for an alteration to an existing home, then the HERS rating can be done on just the accessory dwelling unit, and it can be clearly separated from the original residential dwelling unit. And these can be either additions if they're physically connected to the existing building, or new construction if they're standalone buildings. And then that new construction versus addition question is down to the physical design, and that is based on the language in the International Residential Code that has been in place for decades, not the IEC International Energy Conservation Code, which decides the difference between new construction and additions. And I apologize, I just read that from a PowerPoint slide that the Department of Energy Resources has done for other organizations, but I want.
Yeah, Michael, can you send that slide you were just reading from to me, and I can share it with the counselors?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. We do not have anyone else in the audience. Any counselors have any other? Oh, we're going to do Counselor Stott and then Counselor Hepworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'm going to ask a question that I normally hate because I feel as a council body here, we are in control of what we are in control of as a city, but seeing the Resilient Together logo and header and remembering the project with Beverly and Salem, do you have any indication, or are we still working together as a group with Beverly on this? Do you know if they are looking towards adopting the specialized code as well? I don't know if you have any indication.
So I don't want to speak for Beverly. I mean, I've had conversations. I know that they're looking into it. They're not planning on doing it for a July 1st effective date.
Councillor Hepworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is I guess a comment more than a question, unless I'm wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Duffy. But there was a Wentworth and MIT study that said that the cost of construction, adopting the specialized code, the cost of construction, to Councilor Prasnewski's point, or to his question earlier, would, for a single-family home, would be $10,000 to $23,500 more, and for 2 to 4 family, it would be $34,000 to $105,000 more. I say this as somebody who supports this. I'm sure I'll vote for this when this comes back before the council. But we just need to be clear-eyed about what we're adopting here and the urgency of additional action on housing, because there's probably things within there are a lot of things within our zoning code that are making construction incredibly expensive across the state of Massachusetts. And there's a lot more that we have to tackle if we're going to do stuff like this, which we have to do. There's more action, I think, to take on housing after this. And ideally, we would have taken that action before adopting something like this, if I'm going to be honest. But I know we're headed that way eventually on this. And yeah, just something I think we should all be thinking about.
Yeah, so I think the study that you're referring to is one that was, I believe, funded by the Home Builders and Remodelers Association, and it was somewhat controversial when it came out. I would say that it seemed, I don't want to, it can turn into opinion rather quickly, but it seemed like it left out some pretty important information in their conclusions, or buried the lead, if you will, in a lot of the conclusions that they made. I'm happy to provide you some information that kind of addresses a lot of the points that were made in that study and speaks to them as to why there's more to what is said there. So I'm happy to provide you that information without really like digging in on it right now, because it's a little bit more, it can be a little bit more political.
And I understand these things vary widely, and it's very difficult to give an estimate on that. But it is fair to say that, and again, saying this as someone who supports this, it is fair to say this will increase the cost of construction, correct?
Well, if you're building an electric building, it's the same requirement. So I think, again, like, to that first question, I think it's an easy question to answer if you're talking about a mixed fuel building, because that's the intention. The intention is to discourage construction with mixed fuel. And so there are a lot of incentives to build all electric. But the reason for this, the stretch code discourages it, and this is pushing it even further. And the point that Dylan made, that I'll just reemphasize, is that pre-wiring requirement. I mean, the biggest challenge for us in reducing emissions in terms of buildings is existing buildings and converting them to all electric. It's a really tall task to try to do that. So the idea is, one idea is don't allow people to build with fossil fuels. We're not doing that now. But the idea is, if you're going to build with fossil fuels, we can't contribute to that problem any more than we already have. We can't have that issue be harder than it already is. So make it so when we do convert these buildings to electricity later on, that it's easier to do. So that's the whole point of this. And again, the stretch code does a lot to get there, but I would say the intention is to make it harder with the specialized.
Just want to note that Councilor Watson-Felt has to leave the meeting. I'm going to recognize Councilor Varela and then Councilor Harvey, but I do want to reassert for Councilor Hapworth something that Mr. Patel said, and that is the cost is really the stretch code. It's for existing buildings. When you build an all-electric building, you're still falling under the stretch code. So it's not, igniting the specialized code. So these costs that the Builders Association or whatever is talking about is really for the enhancements to the stretch code. which are all buildings, whether it's new construction or retrofit or whatever. Councilor Varela?
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair Cohen. Not being a member of the committee through to Mr. Duffy, I'm under the impression that the Commonwealth does have an aggressive goal by 2050 to be off of fossil fuels, and that the specialized code is a way to start this process so that down the line, when we have to go fully electric with those now constructed buildings, that they can actually meet those requirements. Am I correct? That's why we're talking about this.
Yep.
I know we're talking about the actual cost of building the buildings, but nobody's mentioned anything about the cost of running these buildings after the fact. If you look at your electric bill, it goes up continuously. So, and I understand, believe me, I'm an electrician. I'm all for it. You guys can put all the electricity you want in these buildings, but the end user has to pay the bill in the end. So, they talk about the heat pumps and stuff like that. Well, heat pumps are only good to a certain temperature. And now you have an electric heater in the air handler inside the people's house that is running once you get below a certain temperature because the heat pump can't keep up with the cold temperatures. So now that's just adding more cost to their electric bill. So, I get it, I understand it, and, like I said, I'm for it because I'm an electrician, but the end users are the ones that are gonna, and then, you said there's no incentives for people doing this as far as any type of grants or any type of kickbacks when, or incentives for them to do this. It's for the builders or, the big thing now I hear is everybody's talking about the heat pumps and you can get up to $10,000 rebate with the heat pump. But when they come into your house, if you don't have the proper windows, the proper insulation, the proper siding, this, that, and the other thing, that $10,000 that they're telling you you're gonna get dwindles down to about $2,000 if you're lucky. So, that's just one of my things, and I get the HERS rating and all that stuff, but it's the end user that I'm concerned about because, electricity doesn't, it's not like with Peabody where they have a low electricity rate. We're in Salem, which is National Grid, which is one of the highest electricity rates in the area. Thank you.
So Peabody and the other communities that own their own electric company, all the profits go back to the community into the power plant. And National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil go to the shareholders. And we pay roughly, residents of Beverly and Salem and other places that have for-profit power companies like National Grid, we pay about 40% more per kilowatt hour. But that's not a product of how we're doing business, it's a product of who's taking the profit. And they put a lot of the money back into the system. I think we have hands up by Dylan. Do we want to recognize Dylan? Dylan, do you have a comment to make?
Thank you, Chair Cohen. I agree with most of what the previous speaker had said. I just want to emphasize the fact that with the incentives, yes, there are kind of several hoops that you have to jump through, which can maybe disincentivize some people. However, Mass Save is a continuously evolving process, and there are some pretty hefty rebates
Dylan,
right
you
now.
Can, speak now.
Sorry, I think that. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened there.
Okay, maybe they're done. Any other comments from the Councilor Marcelo?
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of bookkeeping questions. Neil, is this the presentation that you gave tonight? Is it the same one that you gave at the meeting in November?
Yep.
Okay.
It's minor updates because some other communities have adopted since then, but
So it's only the number of communities?
in terms of the content, it's all
Okay.
the same.
Okay. And then looking at this is posted for discussing the specialized code, but does it also include the adoption of the thing that we put in on December 7th, which is number 601? That was like part 2 of it, right? To actually adopt it.
So the next step would be to refer it to the January 25th meeting if the committee chooses?
Yeah, the order is number 20, though. That's the problem. It doesn't include number 601. Do you know what I'm saying? But that's okay. We can pull it out. I'm just, like I said, I'm just trying to figure out what we're
Ignorant about what to do there. So
motioning on tonight.
the motion, I thought it was to consider the order from December, that was submitted to December 7th.
It looks like what we're doing is we're having it's item number 20, which is to meet to discuss opting into the specialized code, right?
This is, I think that
It should have both.
if you look at the agenda online, it's co-posted.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is not the one that should have. So I don't know.
Okay, all right, I'm just trying to figure out what we're working on here. So, President Hapworth, do you think that we're working on adoption of the specialized code? Is that what we're discussing?
Yeah.
So that's what's going to come out of here?
The meeting to adopt the specialized code, opting into the specialized code.
Okay, all right.
Council Marcillo.
I will make a motion then to refer the adoption of the specialized code back to the council with a positive recommendation for adoption.
Council Marcillo moves to recommend to the full council adoption of the specialized code with a positive recommendation.
Who's on the committee?
I second it.
Seconded by Councilor Gerslow. Any discussion? I'd like to make a discussion. And that is just one sentence. I think this stretch code, for inspectors is really complicated. There's a lot more stuff. It applies to a lot more things. This is just a few things that Mr. Duffy said, but this adopting or opting into the specialized code will enable us to be designated. There's a couple of other criterias. One of them, believe it or not, is having a sustainability and resiliency department. But one of the reasons that the other 32 communities have done this so quickly is that by being designated a climate leader community, it will enable us to get monies which, although we don't know what they are, hopefully could be used for some resiliency projects in Salem. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay. We don't have to do a roll call, do we? Okay. So all in favor? Okay. 4 votes in favor, none opposed. Any other motions? Councilor Marcillo?
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor? Thank you. I want to really appreciate everyone coming and some really great questions. And thank you, Michael and Dylan.